Hello, and thank you for joining me this evening. Since I was unable to make it to StokerCon, Steve has asked me if I do a little video with a reading of my book. So I have my bar, which is our drinks cabinet. I have my con, little black dress. I have an audience and a drink. And of course I have my book. The Watcher in the Woods. Fergus made a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. He blew on the drink, wanting to sip some moisture into his dry mouth, but the heat emanating from the cup promised him a scolding if he tried. Instead, he picked up the pen and stared at the notebook before him. It was of good quality, with a smooth brown leather binding, yet even though the paper was thick, he could still see the lines on the current page where he'd crossed out yesterday's work on the previous one. The temptation to tear out that first incoherent page was almost overwhelming. What will future generations think of me if I can't even write a bloody introduction to what I do every day? But the words just hadn't come. How do you summarise a job that has been passed down from parent to child for almost 2,000 years, one steeped in strangeness and death? He looked out at the forest beyond his window, trying to find inspiration in the autumn colours, but his mind remained a blank. With a sigh, he looked back at the book. Well, maybe I should leave the introduction until last, or at least until later. Let's start with the history instead. He took a sip of his cooling coffee and began to write. The wood has been here for as long as anyone can remember. It belongs to no one, and yet falls under the responsibility of 4 watchers. We are stationed at 4 points around the wood, roughly north, south, east and west. Being a watcher runs in the family. I am writing this because I have no family left to pass the duty on to. I hope whoever reads this will... He stopped writing. Maybe that bit should go in the introduction. He sighed again, wishing this could be easier, wishing he'd had a family of his own so he could tell the history in person, like his father had done with him. Instead, he was forced to write it down to pass on to a stranger, or perhaps for some unknown person to find if he died suddenly in the wood, which was always a possibility. Leaving enough space for a couple of lines to finish off what he'd abandoned, he tried a new approach. Many times the wood has escaped being cut down. With the continual push to provide affordable housing for the country, there have been some close calls. Although I've not seen any assessors during my watching, my uncle did, and he told me the story to my father, who passed it on to me. A man from a building company came out and was taking measurements. My uncle spoke to him, and he seemed absolutely certain that his company would have the winning bid. He wasn't going to cut it all down, just some of it, and build luxury apartments. He reckoned people would pay a lot for this desolate Scottish view. My uncle was forced to leave him to it. When he next looked out the window, the surveyor had vanished. My uncle hoped he had gone home. Fergus took another swallow of coffee. A fresh line of thought occurred to him. Turning to another page, he wrote at the top, "About me." The position of watcher passes down through family members. It should have passed from my uncle to one of his 2 sons, but they were all 3 killed in a car crash. My cousins were just teenagers. So my father had to take up the position. He visited the other 3 watchers, dragging me with him, and they told him what they could. He took him far more than I did. When I came of age, he told me all of what he'd learned during his decade of watching. My mother left us shortly after we moved into this lodge. She said she couldn't stand to be near the forest. He used to wake up at night and hear her weeping downstairs. For about 6 months after she left, I really hated her. But then I began to see more of the lost ones, and I realised that she hadn't meant to be cruel. She'd simply done the only thing she could to keep herself sane. If she'd stayed, I'm certain she'd have become a lost one too, and I couldn't bear to find her during one of my tours of the forest. I still have nightmares about it, even at 41 years old. Fergus read back what he'd written and felt a tightness in his guts. This was all too personal. Fighting back frustration at not being able to finish anything, he flipped back to the previous page and began again. As the afternoon wore on, my uncle did his usual tour of the perimeter of the forest. He found a car and saw letters inside, addressed to the building company the man had mentioned. My uncle hurried back and gathered his tools before heading into the wood. The surveyor was lucky, as my uncle found him before the sun went down. But when they finally emerged from the wood, it was dark, and my uncle said the man had seen things on their walk back that had made his face as white as the moon. My uncle took him into the lodge, where my aunt made the man some hot, sweet tea and forced him to eat a slice of ginger cake. They offered him a bed for the night, but the surveyor shot to his feet and said he wasn't staying a single minute longer near the wood. Even though my uncle was concerned that the man was too shaken up to drive, he nevertheless took him back to his car. The surveyor drove away, weaving slightly from side to side. No luxury apartments were ever built, and no one else has come knocking to ask about such things. I'm sure they will in time, but it seems a watcher need do little to dissuade them. The wood does that well enough, once they step into the gloom of it. So that was the introduction to The Watcher in the Woods. Steve also wanted me to tell you a little bit about the book, which is essentially a book of fairy tales, but they're not Snow White and Cinderella. They're fairy tales about places and people that you might not have heard of. The first story, Hessian Sky, is based on a Russian fairy tale of the soldier and death. If you're like me and you were a Jim Henson Storyteller fan, then you may remember it. A Wolf in the House is a dark version of Little Red Riding Hood, and The Wild Hunt is not so much fairy tale as a British legend. Teeth in the Shadows is based on a German legend involving Charlemagne. I read it in a collection of stories that the Grimm brothers had collated but decided not to use in their final book. It felt wrong to steal all of my stories from other people, so The Watcher in the Woods is my own unique take, my own personal fairy tale. And if it's got any grounding in reality, it's based on a Japanese forest which I may have transported to Scotland. If you enjoyed my reading and would like to purchase the book, that'd be great. If it was okay, but not quite your thing, then I thoroughly recommend that you check out the other Shadows book from Black Shuck, because they're all amazing. Thank you very much.